Good afternoon, this is Dan Bandor, presidential hopeful for 2024. This is, I think, the fourth or fifth video, something like that. So today I would like to cover, well, climate change for one, and then once that's done and you after I explain my stance on it, then I can talk about potential power that we can use for electricity within the States. And the sun is really bright right now. Okay, anyways. So climate change. Now, I'm sure everyone has heard that study where it said 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real. I gotta be honest with you, that number should have been 100%, because the climate is always changing, changes from day to day, changes from month to month, changes from year to year, changes from millennia to millennia. It's always changing. It's never gonna stop changing. So for those 3% who decided not to add their names onto that, what are you guys thinking? Seriously. Now, to get to the more at the heart of the matter of the climate change debate. So what people have been arguing is not necessarily that the climate is changing, but rather that it's humans that are causing it to change faster or slower than it's supposed to in its natural cycle. So what that's called is anthropogenic climate change, and anthro meaning man, and then genic meaning generated from or created from, so man-made, basically, climate change. So, now when it comes to anthropogenic climate change, I have seen enough studies and researched enough to know that there is no clear consensus one way or the other. I've seen some studies that say that, we have, increased, our carbon dioxide emissions or whatever, have increased the warming of the planet to the point where, it's gonna end in 500 years. I've seen others where it says, 100 years. And then, of course, we've got AOC, who says 12 years because she's just a gem. But yeah, so here's the thing. The Earth isn't gonna end. It's not gonna end anytime within the next few million years. I mean, unless a big ass asteroid comes along and hits us. I mean, that's the only way that I could see it ending. So, that being said, anthropogenic climate change. My personal opinion, after what I've read and studied, I've looked into the Milankovitch cycles, I've looked into, the sun's activity and how it affects the climate. I've seen some of the studies that have been proposed that say that anthropogenic climate change is real, and then I've seen other studies that debunk those studies. So it's a mess. Climate change is a very, very complex topic. And the thing is that if some of these studies are correct, we haven't done anything. We might be contributing 0.1% to either increasing or slowing down the natural rate of climate change, which in the grand scheme of things is 100 years in every 100,000. It's nothing, basically. It's a statistical zero, basically. Now, I'm not saying that those studies are the correct ones. Like I said, I've seen enough studies to know that I can't make a definitive answer one way or the other. And so with that being said, we have to think about what that means and what we can do with policies that, seek to approach climate change, either slowing it down, speeding it up, keeping it the same, anything like that. We need to approach anything like that with a lot of caution. So a lot of the ideas that are going around with the Democratic Party put a massive burden on not only our economy, but the global economy. Unfortunately, much of the world's economy is dependent upon the United States, so if we take a big hit, guess what? That just trickles right down and everyone else takes a big hit on top of it. So when we start thinking about policies that would dramatically affect our economy, we need to take a step back. We need to take a good long 5 years to breathe first, get the data, at least as much data as we can, and try to implement policies that will not break the economy. So I understand that, the climate and our ability to survive on the planet is more important than the money that people are making. I get that argument. I even kind of somewhat agree with it. But at the same time, the economy is also dependent, well, not dependent, but it helps people live, right? So if, let's say that you have to go to the store and buy food, right? Well, if the food that you're buying is now 10 times the cost because the cost of growing it in a climate-friendly way has dramatically increased the cost, well, that gets passed down to everyone who buys the food. So now everyone is paying a lot more money for the food because it's climate, conscious or whatever. And so it just, the problem is that people don't think of the implications of the policies that they're trying to propose. They're just like, oh, let's do this. Let's just change everything and do this and upgrade all the buildings. I'm referring to AOC's new Green New Deal, or whatever. Anyways, I think that was the stupidest piece of legislation I've ever read. That's just my personal opinion. So climate change, I'm more inclined to believe that we're not making a significant impact than I am to thinking that the world's going to end in like 100 years or 1,000 years. My gut tells me that that's the case. Some of the studies and the refutations of other studies that I've read also tell me that that's the case. So as far as climate change goes, that's my view on it. And with all of that being said, just because I don't believe that anthropogenic climate change is a thing, or at least not as big of a thing as people are making it out to be, doesn't mean that I don't think we should take care of our planet. Because, it's our planet. It's the only place we've got. If the planet goes to shit, well, guess what? We die. Apologize for the swearing. So, with that being said, there's nothing wrong with being a good steward for the planet. So you can both believe that anthropogenic climate change is not a thing and want to take care of the planet. All right, we've seen the effects of pollution, especially in places like China, some of their more industrial cities where you can't see a mile because of all the smog in the air. It's bad. So I do think that we should take care of our planet. And I can believe that and also not believe that anthropogenic climate change is really a thing. So the two are not mutually exclusive. So with that being said, this is a little good way to switch over to my next topic, which is power. So modern civilization runs on electricity. There's no other way around it. Our hospitals need it, our cars need it. Even if they're gas fueled, they still have electricity in there. You still have to charge batteries and all that other fun stuff. Especially if you drive a hybrid car like I do, that's dependent upon electricity. So we need to find a way to create electricity cheaply, efficiently, and as cleanly as possible. So with that being said, that doesn't mean that we can just take one particular technology and apply it everywhere, because most of the time it doesn't work like that. So solar, right? You can take solar, set it up in the deserts of Nevada, New Mexico, and they would work great, right? But if you try to set them up in like the Appalachians, like up near the top where we've got all the cloud cover most of the time, they're not going to do a damn thing. And if you're here in Wisconsin, you aren't going to get anywhere near as much electricity out of those as you think you will. And then add to that, the cost is ridiculous. The only reason that most people can afford solar is because the government is subsidizing it, which means that the government is helping you pay for those solar panels. And that is really bright. The sun, fun times. Anyways, so not every power solution will work everywhere. And especially, let's go with coal, right? Coal is pretty standard. I think coal could pretty much work just about anywhere, except for places where it's not economical to get coal to it, right? So coal power plants, they need train loads. Like literal train loads, like 80 cars of coal going to a power plant, dumping it all off, and then burning it. I mean, if you don't have access to a railway that can deliver that much coal, then you're... Wow, it is really bright. Okay. Anyways, so if you don't have the infrastructure to get the coal to the plant, then it's not viable, right? Now, we've got other plants such as natural gas, which are cleaner than coal, although still, technically burning fossil fuels. So now those, because they can work off of a pipeline depending on how big they are, those can be used in other areas that coal and solar cannot be used, and it's more effective for them to be there. And then if you've got things like wind, I mean, wind is great like in the Midwestern plains where you've got just constant wind all the time. Great. But when you're on places like in the valleys of mountains where you don't actually have a lot of wind, or if you're in some places where the wind is so strong that the turbines, if they were left to spin, would actually pull themselves apart. I've seen it happen. It's not pretty. It's extremely destructive, and I know you can't really tell by looking at them up in the air, but just one propeller of those things is longer than a semi-truck bed. They are huge, and when they fly off, because the thing is spinning too fast, if you have a house in the way, that house is gone. There is no way around that. And so wind has its limitations. If the wind isn't blowing fast enough, it's not going to generate electricity. If the wind is blowing too fast, they have to brake the things. Brake as in like a car brake, slow it down or completely stop it. So that way the thing doesn't spin apart. So wind has its limitations. Solar has its limitations. Coal also has its limitations. Also, it's probably the dirtiest of all of the methods of production of electricity that we have. Natural gas is also somewhat dirty, not as dirty as coal, but still more dirty than the other two, wind and solar. Tidal energy can only be used on the coasts. Hydroelectric energy, such as dams, can only be used where there is, well, one, you need a really large change in height, and you also have to have a lot of water up here. You have to stop it, have a little water going down here, and then the dam, what that does is it controls how much water goes through at any given time, and that's how it generates electricity. So you can only use dams in certain places. Other places where you don't have rivers, or if you have millions of little streams but they're not big enough to actually make a dam out of, you can't use it. So each different way of generating power has its limitations. And now let's go to nuclear, right? So we have 3 nuclear disasters that everyone is afraid of. 1, Chernobyl, human error. 2, 3 Mile Island. That one was, I think, they didn't keep up with all the pipes and everything, and so one of them broke, which caused catastrophic failure within the whole thing. But from what I understand is when 3 Mile Island did go down, it actually went down exactly as it was supposed to, and it prevented one of the other reactors from going critical or something like that. I'll have to do my research, but from what I understand is when 3 Mile Island did go off, it was nowhere near as bad as it could have been if it was something like Chernobyl. And then we go to Fukushima, which is in Japan. So one, nuclear is a terrible idea for Japan because they get a lot of earthquakes. Earthquakes are not very friendly to concrete. Concrete breaks, but you need that concrete in order to make sure that everything stays inside, especially when, like, the big concrete domes that are supposed to be able to handle all of the steam once that comes out, if it comes out. Those crack, and then all of a sudden you get radioactive steam coming out in the case of a meltdown, not all the time. And then on top of that, you need a really big reservoir of water for cooling. And, also you don't want to put it anywhere near the coast, well, at least not on coasts where you can actually get a lot of hurricanes, that kind of thing. Tsunamis especially. So nuclear is not good for every place, but let's say that you want to go in Midwestern United States, right? So you do have tornadoes every once in a while. Well, I shouldn't say every once in a while. I think they have tornadoes every year and multiple tornadoes every year. But, there are some places in the Midwest, like Wisconsin, for example, where we don't get very many tornadoes. The ground is very solid. While we do get earthquakes, they are so small that you don't even feel them, which means that they're really not going to do anything to the concrete of the reactor. So Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, these places would be really good candidates for nuclear power. If you go over to like New York, Pennsylvania, these would also be really good candidates for nuclear power. As you go farther south, Florida, probably not. Most of Florida has really soft ground. Nuclear reactors are quite heavy and you want to make sure that they stay level. So Florida, at least anywhere along the coast or the Atlantic Ocean, bad idea. Northern Georgia would probably be pretty good. Tennessee, Kentucky, those would probably be pretty good. Texas definitely would be pretty good. So there are a lot of places that nuclear can be used efficiently, effectively. And the good thing about nuclear is that it is without a doubt the cleanest as far as building it and running it, maintaining it than any other one. So apart from maybe wind and like hydroelectric or something. So what you get out of a nuclear reactor is steam, right? Steam is water, and it's not radiated water, unless of course there's a meltdown, then you have a problem. But we're coming up with technologies these days where they use like a liquid fuel. And what happens is, so long as there's power, there's like a block of salt, and they keep it frozen. So imagine like a big tank, right? And at the bottom of the tank is like a little tiny tube, and inside this tube is a block of salt. Now, inside the tank, super hot temperatures could easily melt the salt, turn it into a liquid, all that other fun stuff, right? But so what they do is they take this block of salt and they freeze it, using cryo technology, whatever. And so long as the reactor is running and it has power, that stays in solid form. As soon as there's any kind of, catastrophic failure to where power goes out, and you need that power to, regulate everything that's inside, well, then the thing that's keeping this block of salt solid goes away, which means that eventually it melts, and then all of the radioactive fuel that's inside this tank drains down into a tank that's further down into the ground, where it cannot, go through its fission or whatever, and it's completely safe. Now, granted, you have to make sure that the pipes are maintained, they don't rust out, and all that other fun stuff, but for the most part, we've got technologies these days that make nuclear reactors almost 100% safe. And if you go and you look up studies on the number of deaths in the creation of wind power and the operation of wind power, solar, natural gas, coal, anything like that, you'll find that nuclear, even if you account for all of the things that happened with Chernobyl, all the injuries, all the radiation, all the death with that, if you combine all of that in there, nuclear is still far safer than any of these other ones. So in my humble opinion, nuclear is the way to go until we can crack fusion. Now, as soon as we can crack fusion, then absolutely fusion for everything. And then there's another reason why nuclear power does better than solar and wind. And so I work for an electric utility, right? So we maintain the electric grid, and we have to make sure that, all this, basically that we're meeting the demand for whatever's on the system. And throughout the day, it's like a graph, right? Towards the evening, electricity spikes up. That's when people are getting home, turning on the TVs, turning on the air conditioning, all that other fun stuff. And then as it gets into the night, then it drops down, and then into the morning, and then then you got the morning and it goes back, and it's a cycle like this, right? So what we have to do as a utility is we have to make sure that we match that, supplying just a little bit more power than what's needed on the grid. And so by supplying just a little bit more power than what's needed on the grid, we can cut down on how much coal or natural gas or whatever it is that we're using. We can cut down on that, which means that we're putting out less carbon emissions, and we are maintaining what the grid needs. The problem with wind and solar is that they're not, Okay, so remember my graph, right? It goes up and then it goes back down. So let's say that you get towards the morning, right? And all of a sudden the clouds part and you get a really bright sunny day. Now all of a sudden all of those solar panels that are connected to the grid start pumping out a lot of juice, right? Now, as long as they're pumping out the juice, then we have to slow down all of our power plants because we don't want to be producing this much when we only need this much electricity down here, right? So we want to try to keep it like this. So having them on the grid is a lot harder to maintain. And then let's say that you're in peak time or whatever and it's super bright out, and so our power plants aren't running as much as they normally would be because we've got all this extra power being created by, wind and solar. And then all of a sudden the clouds come in and the wind stops, right? Well, now our generation goes like this because all of that power that we were getting from the solar and wind drops. And our demand is still up here. So what we have to do is we have to spin up another power plant or, spin up more generators within the power plant to get our generation back up to there. And the problem with that is that it takes time. Like coal has to get to a certain temperature to where it is burning enough to be, I don't know what the right word is. It's not sustainable, sort of sustainable, like where it has a sustained burn or whatever. And we try to keep it at that, right? And, natural gas, I think, can actually spin up a little bit faster because natural gas just, you blow it in, light a match, boom, there you go, it burns. Coal takes a lot longer, so when our demand is here and our supply is right here, if our supply drops like this, well then we're gonna have a little tiny gap in here where our demand is higher than what we're actually supplying, and then once that happens, that's when you start getting brownouts. And no one likes brownouts, right? So what happens is that we always have to keep a spinning reserve, and what that means is that we have to keep a power plant that's always running, even though it's not necessarily, supplying power to the grid, just in case we hit that time to where clouds come in and the wind dies, and we have to connect that in immediately to get the demand back up, or the supply to meet the demand. And so we have to keep that always spinning and always going. And so we're wasting fuel over here because solar and wind it's not consistent. And it's really, really, really hard on the grid. Now, if you had your home and you were powering it only off of solar and wind and you weren't connected to the grid at all, then there wouldn't be a problem. But the problem is that there's a lot of policies out there that say that if you have wind and if you have solar, you have to be connected to the grid. And so I don't know. So that's my spiel, right? I think nuclear is the way to go where it's feasible. In places where it's not feasible, you go with the cleanest one that you've got. And then while wind and solar are good, for the most part, when they're running, if they're running, it puts a lot of hardship on the grid, and we don't have adequate storage systems for all the power. So let's say that our demand is up here, then all of a sudden it gets really, really bright like it is right now with the reflection that you keep seeing here, and then our supply goes way up right here, goes way above what our demand is. Instead of shutting down our power plants, that way the whatever the total supply that we're getting meets the demand, what we could do is we could take all of that extra stuff there and store it in batteries. And then as we get towards, the evening or whatever, then we could rely on these batteries, which we can control, how much power comes out, and then add that to our power plants. So that way we can get a sustained, supply demand curve. But the problem is that we don't have the technology yet to be able to store grid-sized power. I know that they're working on some liquid metal batteries, which I think are going to be really, really cool once they can actually get it going. But we can't really viably support wind and solar yet on the grid without basically wasting money with the fuel that we're burning, because we have to keep these spinning reserves up. So that's my spiel. We have covered climate change, we've covered power. I know I went way in depth into the power, but it is something that I'm passionate about and I do a lot of research into, so I like to think I'm pretty knowledgeable. I'm not an expert by any means, but relatively knowledgeable as far as all that goes. Yeah, and I think that should cover it. This is probably going to be a really long video, but that's okay. And I guess the final thing we have to talk about is Patreon. So, if you would like to support my campaign, once again, I'm running for president 2024. If you'd like to support my campaign, go to Patreon. The link is below in the description. And I ask that you donate only $1. Just $1, no more. And then if ever I start to stray away from what you're expecting me to do or what you want me to do, withdraw your support. And then what this does is it keeps me in line with what the people are wanting. And it gives me an idea of how I'm doing. Like if I get like 100,000, patrons, and then all of a sudden it dips down to like 60,000, well then I just did something that, I should look at again, right? So it's a good way to determine how I'm doing. So once again, Patreon, description below. Donate only $1. If you do donate, thank you. I do appreciate it. And yeah, we'll see you in the next video. Bye.